In a calm, quiet neighborhood, where neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences masked an idyllic facade, a dark secret festered beneath the surface. The Jacobs family seemed the picture of perfection, respected, admired, and seemingly untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But behind their polished lives, a chilling truth lurked, waiting to be unearthed. One girl, curious and determined, would stumble upon it, leading to a discovery that would shatter their carefully crafted world. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, far removed from the chaos of the city, lived a family whose seemingly perfect life masked a dark secret. Like many others, the Jacobs family appeared to enjoy a life of comfort and harmony. Their two-story house, with its neatly trimmed lawn and white picket fence, gave the impression of stability and success. Robert and Margaret Jacobs were respected by their community for their dedication to their careers, involvement in local causes, and devotion to their daughter, Lisa. However, behind closed doors, their family dynamic was far from ordinary. Lisa was not their biological child. At 6 years old, she had been adopted. The Jacobs claimed they had been unable to conceive and chose to give a child in need a loving home. To everyone who knew them, it seemed like a noble gesture. Lisa grew up in that house, surrounded by all the privileges her adoptive parents could offer. Yet, as she grew older, she began to notice details that didn't quite add up. Small discrepancies at first, whispers at night when she thought she was alone, and strange behavior when certain topics were brought up. By the time Lisa turned 18, her curiosity had grown strong enough for her to start asking questions, but Robert and Margaret didn't provide answers. Their responses weren't angry or confrontational, but there was always an air of discomfort when Lisa pressed them. At first, she believed they were merely protecting her from some unpleasant truth. Perhaps her biological parents had died or been involved in something criminal. However, deep down, Lisa felt something far more unsettling. Driven by youthful determination, Lisa began investigating. She searched through old photo albums, hoping to find clues about her past, but the photos only went back to the time of her adoption. Then she realized she wasn't alone. There were no pictures of her as an infant, and the few photos of her biological parents seemed distant and impersonal, offering no insight into who they were or why they had given her up. She also contacted the adoption agency, but their records were suspiciously sparse, as if someone had deliberately erased key parts of her history. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Her relationship with Robert and Margaret began to change as they noticed her growing curiosity. They didn't confront her, but their behavior became more protective and watchful. They began questioning her actions and keeping a closer eye on her. At first, Lisa thought this was just overprotective parenting, but as she continued her search, their behavior became increasingly unsettling. One day, while cleaning out the attic, Lisa found a locked chest tucked away in a corner. Inside, she discovered old newspaper clippings, yellowed and aged. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, but as Lisa read through them, she noticed a pattern. Articles detailing a series of violent crimes that had taken place in the area over 2 decades ago. The victims were all young women, and the crimes were far more brutal than she could have ever imagined. Even more chillingly, one of the articles mentioned Robert and Margaret's names as suspects, though they had never been charged. Lisa's heart raced as she read and reread the article. The idea that her loving parents could be linked to such horrific acts seemed impossible. But the more she thought about it, the more things began to make sense. Lisa spent days in shock, unsure whether to confront Robert and Margaret or go to the police. Part of her wanted to believe there was a logical explanation, but the other part, the part that had been suspicious for years, knew the truth was staring her in the face. Determined to find more answers, Lisa spent hours at the library researching old newspapers and archives. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that her adoptive parents were involved. The evidence was circumstantial, but enough of it raised serious doubts. Finally, Lisa discovered a police report mentioning a witness who had identified Robert and Margaret as suspects. However, before the case could go to trial, the witness had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. In some cases, they were screened out. Lisa knew deep down that her parents had silenced the witness to protect themselves. She faced an impossible choice: go to the police and risk destroying her family, or stay silent and live with the knowledge that her parents were murderers. But Lisa wasn't the type to remain silent. Gathering all the evidence, newspaper clippings, police reports, and her own notes, she planned to take everything to the police the following morning. That night, however, Robert and Margaret watched her closely. They noticed the changes in her behavior, the late nights spent researching, the distant look in her eyes. When they saw the evidence in her hands, they knew she had discovered the truth. In the early hours, they entered Lisa's room, their faces twisted with fear and determination. Lisa awoke just as Robert raised a pillow to her face. Despite her struggles and terror, Margaret held her down, whispering apologies as they suffocated her. It was over quickly. Robert and Margaret stood in the dark, panting and trembling. They had killed their daughter, the child they had raised and loved for over a decade, but they believed they had no choice. They had to protect themselves. In the following hours, they cleaned up, disposed of the evidence, and convinced the police that Lisa had run away. Months passed, and the town mourned her disappearance. Robert and Margaret played their roles convincingly, but the truth remained buried deep, waiting to resurface. But Detective Monica Monroe wouldn't let it rest. She had been the lead investigator on Lisa's case from the beginning, and something about it had never sat right with her. The Jacobs' behavior had always seemed too rehearsed, too controlled. As the case went cold, Monroe's instincts refused to let go. Months after the investigation was declared inactive, Monroe began digging through old case files again. Every detail of the investigation was meticulously reviewed, every clue reassessed. One detail that had initially been overlooked was a locked chest found in the Jacobs' attic during the first search. At the time, it had been dismissed as irrelevant, but something about it nagged at Monroe. With a renewed sense of purpose, she sought permission to return to the Jacobs' home. Officially, the case was still open, giving her the justification to investigate further. When she arrived, Robert and Margaret welcomed her with polite but guarded smiles. They had expected follow-up visits, but this one felt different. Monroe's questions were routine at first, but as they talked, she casually asked about the chest in the attic. Margaret stiffened at the mention of it, while Robert quickly changed the subject. That reaction was all Monroe needed. She knew something was wrong. Later that day, with a warrant in hand, Monroe searched the house again. The attic and the chest were examined more thoroughly. To the untrained eye, the contents seemed harmless: old clippings, faded photographs, and childhood memorabilia. But Monroe had a keen eye for detail. She noticed that some of the newspaper clippings were about a string of unsolved murders that had occurred decades earlier. These weren't just any crimes. They were brutal, involving young women who vanished without a trace. Monroe began to piece together a pattern. The dates of the murders coincided with the time just before Lisa's adoption. The most chilling detail? The names of two suspects, Robert and Margaret Jacobs, had been mentioned in connection with the unsolved crimes. Monroe's heart pounded as she connected the dots. Could it be that the seemingly perfect couple had a violent past? Had they adopted Lisa to escape their dark history, only to kill her when she stumbled upon their deadly secrets? Monroe pulled the old police files on the unsolved murders and found something startling. The victims had been young women, much like Lisa. Robert and Margaret had been questioned at the time, but there had never been enough evidence to charge them. The case had gone cold, much like Lisa's disappearance. But now, with this new connection, Monroe had what she needed to reopen the investigation. She interviewed former colleagues who had worked the original murder cases, and slowly, more details began to emerge. Witnesses began to recall Robert and Margaret's suspicious behavior near the crime scenes, inconsistencies in their alibis, and, most damning of all, a missing witness who had once been ready to testify against them. The more Monroe dug, the more certain she became that Robert and Margaret were guilty, not just of Lisa's murder, but of the unsolved murders from decades earlier. Confronting the Jacobs with her findings, Monroe pressed them for answers. At first, they denied everything, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret, already unraveling under the pressure, broke down in a tearful confession. She admitted that Lisa had discovered their past and had planned to go to the police. "We couldn't let that happen," she explained, her voice shaking. "We had to protect ourselves." Robert, cold and calculating as ever, tried to maintain his composure, but under intense interrogation, even he eventually cracked. He admitted to their involvement in the murders and the lengths they had gone to in order to hide their past. With their confessions, Robert and Margaret were arrested. The case of Lisa's disappearance was finally solved, but the town was left in shock. The Jacobs had been pillars of the community, respected, admired, even loved. To think that they had lived a lie for decades was almost too much for people to comprehend. The trial was swift and brutal. The prosecution laid out the full extent of Robert and Margaret's crimes, painting a picture of two cold-blooded killers who had built a new life on the ashes of their victims. Lisa, the child they had adopted, had become their final victim. When she had stumbled upon the truth, the Jacobs acted out of desperation to protect themselves. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Robert and Margaret were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As they were led away in handcuffs, the once perfect couple looked broken, their masks of civility shattered. The town, still reeling from the revelations, could finally begin to heal, but the scars from the Jacobs' betrayal would linger for years to come. In the aftermath, Detective Monroe was hailed as a hero for her relentless pursuit of the truth. But for her, the victory was bittersweet. She couldn't help but think of Lisa, the young woman who had been so close to escaping her parents' deadly grasp, only to be silenced before she could reveal the truth. Lisa had died a tragic death, but, in the end, her discovery had brought her killers to justice. The Jacobs' home, once the epitome of suburban bliss, stood empty, a haunting reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. The neighbors, who had once envied the family, now avoided the house, unwilling to confront the darkness that had lurked beneath its pristine facade. As the town slowly moved on, they never forgot the lessons they had learned: that evil can hide in plain sight, that even the most seemingly perfect lives can be built on lies, and that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, will always find a way to the surface. In the end, justice was served, but the cost was immense. Lisa's life had been taken by the very people who were supposed to protect her, and the town would never be the same. The case became a reminder of the fragility of trust, the thin line between love and manipulation, and of the lengths people would go to protect their darkest secrets. Lisa's legacy, however tragic, was that her pursuit of the truth had finally brought peace to the souls of those who had been silenced by Robert and Margaret Jacobs. This has been another episode of Shadowed Secrets, where we explore the darkest corners of the human mind and the crimes that shook the world. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our latest episodes. Until next time, stay safe and keep your loved ones close. Wouldn't you love to subscribe right now, as this documentary gets interesting? On television, they cried, pleaded for their daughter's safe return, and held vigils in her memory. To anyone who knew them, the Jacobs appeared to be the epitome of grief-stricken parents, desperate for answers. Margaret and Robert seemed like they had lost their grip on reality, their faces etched with anguish as they begged for sympathy and understanding. They were no longer the composed, successful figures their neighbors had always admired. The Jacobs were now reduced to hollow, broken shadows of the people they once were. However, behind closed doors, The guilt that weighed heavily on their hearts threatened to unravel the carefully constructed narrative that Lisa had simply run away. Margaret seemed to crumble under the pressure, spending countless hours staring out the window, hands trembling, lost in thought. Her once steady composure had long since eroded, replaced by the echoes of her own sleepless nights, filled with guilt and regret. Robert, meanwhile, remained calculated and composed. Though his calm exterior belied the storm raging inside, he knew they had to keep up the pretense of normalcy, pretending nothing was wrong, as though maintaining appearances would somehow shield them from the truth. But he, too, was tormented by their dark past. His mind was plagued by memories of the crimes they had committed, the lives they had stolen, and the lengths they had gone to cover their tracks. The town had largely moved on from Lisa's disappearance. There were no solid leads, no body, and no concrete evidence linking her to foul play. The police had conducted a brief investigation, but without a body or meaningful leads, they had ultimately concluded that Lisa had run away. After all, it wasn't uncommon for teenagers to vanish, especially in a quiet suburban town where the temptation to escape was often irresistible. But even with the case growing colder by the day, one person refused to let it go. Detective Monica Monroe. Known for her relentless pursuit of justice, Monroe had always trusted her instincts. Something about Jakob's behavior had always felt off, too rehearsed, too controlled. Months after the investigation went cold, she meticulously reviewed the case files once again, poring over every detail with renewed determination. It wasn't long before a small detail from the early days of the investigation caught her attention. In the attic of the Jacobs home, a locked chest had been discovered. At the time, it had been dismissed as irrelevant, a container filled with old newspapers and family memorabilia. But as Monroe sifted through the old records, a nagging thought returned. What if something had been missed? What if the chest held more than sentimental trinkets? With renewed purpose, Monroe sought permission to revisit the Jacobs home. The case was still technically open, and she reasoned a follow-up visit would be justified. When she arrived, Robert and Margaret welcomed her with polite but guarded smiles, their unease evident. They had expected the occasional follow-up, but Monroe's presence made them distinctly uncomfortable. Her questions began routine. About Lisa, the chest, their activities. But as the interview progressed, Monroe casually brought up the chest again. Margaret stiffened noticeably, and Robert quickly changed the subject. That reaction wasn't lost on Monroe. It was a slip, one she knew signified something far deeper than denial. Later that day, Monroe obtained a warrant to search the house again. This time, her focus was sharper. In the attic, the chest was still there, collecting dust. As she opened it, Monroe's breath caught in her throat. Inside, she discovered a trove of old newspaper clippings, yellowed and aged, yet chillingly familiar. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Articles detailing a series of violent crimes that had taken place in the area over 2 decades ago. But something about them sent a chill down Monroe's spine. The victims were young women, and the crimes were brutal, far more violent than anything Lisa had described. As Monroe read further, the dates jumped out at her. The murders had occurred around the time Lisa had been adopted. And then she saw the names. 2 suspects had once been investigated, but never charged. Robert and Margaret Jacobs. Her heart pounded as she connected the dots. Could it be that the seemingly perfect couple had a violent past? Had they adopted Lisa to escape that past, only to have their own dark history catch up with them? Monroe didn't hesitate. She pulled the old police files on the unsolved murders and found even more damning evidence. Former colleagues corroborated her findings. Robert and Margaret had inconsistencies in their alibis. They were seen near the crime scenes. And a missing witness, someone who had been ready to testify against them, had disappeared without a trace. The more Monroe dug, the more certain she became. Robert and Margaret weren't just involved in Lisa's disappearance. They were responsible for the unsolved murders of those young women as well. With this renewed information, Monroe confronted Jacobs. At first they denied everything, but Margaret, already unraveling under the weight of guilt, broke down in a tearful confession. Lisa, she said, had discovered their past and planned to go to the police. They couldn't let that happen. Their fears, their guilt, their terror. They had killed her to protect themselves, just as they had killed the other young women from decades ago. Robert, cold and calculating, held out as long as he could, but under intense interrogation, he too cracked. The evidence was overwhelming, and their lies couldn't withstand the weight of the truth. With their confessions, Robert and Margaret were arrested. The case of Lisa's disappearance was finally solved. Yet the town was left in shock. The Jacobs, once pillars of the community, respected, admired, even loved, were now seen as cold-blooded killers. The facade they had so meticulously crafted was shattered, and the people who had once admired them now recoiled from the memory of their betrayal. The trial was swift and brutal. The prosecution laid out the full extent of Robert and Margaret's crimes, painting a picture of two cold-blooded killers who had built a new life on the ashes of their victims. Lisa, their final victim, had stumbled upon the truth and had been silenced before she could speak. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. Robert and Margaret were sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As they were led away in handcuffs, their once perfect composure shattered. The town began to heal, but the scars of their betrayal would linger for years. Detective Monroe was hailed as a hero, but her victory felt hollow. She couldn't erase the image of Lisa, the young woman who had been so close to escaping her parents' deadly grasp, only to be silenced before she could reveal the truth. Lisa's quest for justice had brought her killers to justice, but at a tremendous cost. The Jacobs home, once a symbol of suburban bliss, now stood empty, a reminder of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. Neighbors, who had once admired the family, now avoided the house, unable to confront the darkness lurking behind its pristine facade. As the town moved on, they never forgot the lessons. Evil can hide in plain sight. Even the most perfect lives can be built on lies. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface. Justice had been served, but the cost was immense. Lisa's life had been stolen by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Her legacy, though tragic, was that her pursuit of truth had finally brought justice to the souls silenced by Robert and Margaret Jacobs. Bristol, UK. Like, share, comment and subscribe to the channel for more interesting documentaries. Until next time.